There's this odd thing that happens when people start getting into jazz fusion. They go straight to the landmarks. You know the ones: Headhunters, Bitches Brew, Heavy Weather, Romantic Warrior, and rightly so. But the unintended side effect is that it gives you the impression that the 70s was dominated by a handful of records by a handful of giants. It wasn't. What actually happened in the 70s is that jazz didn't just go electric, it went professional. Suddenly you had studio musicians, soul players, gospel organists, arrangers, pop writers, session horn sections, all colliding with improvising jazz musicians. And instead of one fusion sound, you got dozens of local sounds. New York had one, LA had another. The CTI sound was its own universe. The organ circuit was still alive. Even string players were crossing over. So today I want to talk about 5 albums that sit just under the surface of the big classics. Records musicians quietly respect, and listeners often discover years later saying, "How did nobody tell me about this?" So first up, we have an album by the Brecker Brothers named The Brecker Brothers from 1975. If you want to understand 70s New York studio fusion, this is basically the Rosetta Stone. Before they were known as the Brecker Brothers, Michael and Randy Brecker were everywhere. They were on records you already know whether you realize it or not. Steely Dan, James Taylor, Parliament, Billy Cobham, Horace Silver. They were the session horn players that producers called when they wanted jazz musicians who could genuinely sit inside the groove. And this album sounds exactly like that world. It doesn't sound like a band inside a room discovering electricity like Miles did. It sounded like musicians who already understood recording studios, arrangement, and precision. Some skunk funk is really the centerpiece here. The first thing you notice is the rhythm section discipline. The groove is tight in a very specific way. Not loose funk, not straight jazz swing. It's locked, almost engineered. That's a huge part of why this record still sounds modern. Then Michael Brecker comes in. Michael Brecker was one of the most influential tenor saxophonists after Coltrane, but not because he sounded like Coltrane. What he did was bring post-Coltrane harmonic language into funk rhythm. He's playing advanced harmony, substitutions, intervallic lines, but over a groove you could almost dance to. And the other secret ingredient? Randy Brecker. The trumpet and tenor together give this album its identity. They don't solo at each other, they phrase like a horn section. You can hear their arranging minds working, riffs answering solos, unison lines punctuating phrases. It's as much composition as it is improvisation. A lot of modern jazz funk traces a line back to this record. Next, we have an album by Ronnie Laws named Friends and Strangers from 1977. This is very much an LA record and you can hear it instantly. Where the Brecker Brothers are sharp edges and city precision, Ronnie Laws is warmth, air and melody. Ronnie Laws was part of a musical family. His sister is Deborah Laws and his brother Hubert Laws is one of the great classical jazz flute players. But Ronnie found this perfect middle ground between jazz improvisation and R&B songwriting. The title track Friends and Strangers is almost deceptive. It's smooth, but it's not lightweight. The harmony is richer than you expect and the groove is subtle. What makes it work is tone. Ronnie Laws had one of the most recognizable saxophone sounds of the decade. Bright, singing, and very vocal in phrasing. He plays melodies as if he's singing lyrics that aren't there. And that was important in the late 70s. Jazz fusion was in danger of becoming very technical and musician-focused. Records like this kept it human. You could play this in your living room and non-jazz listeners would stay in the room. This album shows how close jazz and what would soon be called quiet storm R&B actually were. Many R&B producers later borrowed directly from this sound. The layered electric pianos, soft rhythm guitar, supportive but sophisticated harmony. It's a gateway album in the best sense. You don't study it, you live with it. Now we have an album by Noel Pointer named Phantazia from 1977. One of the most interesting side roads of fusion in the 70s was the electric violin. Jean-Luc Ponty gets most of the attention, deservedly, but Noel Pointer took a completely different approach. Pointer came out of classical training and R&B sessions, and instead of treating the violin as a synthesizer replacement or a rock instrument, he treated it as a lead soul voice. The track Night Song is a perfect example. Listen to how he phrases. He blends into notes, delays resolutions, slides between pitches, techniques that string players don't normally emphasize in classical settings. He's borrowing from vocalists and saxophonists more than violinists. And then there's the production. This record sits right in the late 70s sweet spot where jazz, disco and soul recording techniques were merging. You've got electric piano, supportive rhythm guitar, and a groove that's gentle but insistent. The violin just floats over it. Pointer never overplays, that's the key. Fusion violin often becomes virtuosic display. Here, it becomes atmosphere. If someone were to think that jazz funk is just chops and speed, this album quietly disproves that. Now we have an album by Bobby Hutcherson named San Francisco from 1971. This one is fascinating because Bobby Hutcherson was already an established modern jazz musician on Blue Note in the 60s, a vibraphonist associated with post-bop and more exploratory records. And then the 70s arrived. A lot of jazz musicians had to make a decision, ignore the new sounds or engage with them. Hutcherson didn't abandon jazz language, he translated it. And an important part of that translation is tenor saxophonist Harold Land, who he recorded with extensively around this period. Land had deep roots in hard bop, and his presence grounds the record in jazz tradition even while the rhythm section moves towards funk. My favourite track, Going Down South, is where you really hear that. The groove is earthy, almost blues funk, but on top of it you have vibraphone, an instrument associated with cool jazz, playing lines that still use jazz harmony and phrasing. And alongside him, Land's tenor provides a warmer, more direct melodic voice, almost acting as the human counterbalance to the shimmer of the vibraphone. It's a bridge between eras. The vibraphone itself changes the feel of fusion. Electric keyboards dominate most fusion records. The vibraphone adds attack and shimmer at the same time. Each note has a percussive front and a sustained ring, so it sits both inside the rhythm and above it. Hutcherson's improvisation is also very melodic. He doesn't try to outdo anyone. Instead, he uses space and motif development, almost conversational improvising, and that makes the groove feel deeper rather than busier. This is one of the early moments where you can hear jazz musicians learning that electric rhythm sections didn't mean abandoning musicality. Now we have an album by Jack McDuff named Who Knows What Tomorrow's Gonna Bring from 1970. And this is the other branch of fusion history that people forget. The organ circuit never stopped. While fusion bands were playing concert halls, organ trios were still playing bars, clubs and dance rooms. Jack McDuff came from that world, the soul jazz tradition, and instead of going full fusion, he absorbed elements of it. My favourite track, Classic Funk, tells you everything immediately. The Hammond organ is the engine. The harmony moves because of the organist's hands and feet. Bass pedals, chord stabs, gospel voicings. The groove is physical. McDuff's playing comes straight out of the blues and church vocabulary. Short phrases, call and response ideas, rhythmic emphasis over harmonic complexity. But the rhythm section and recording style are more modern than 60s soul jazz. Tighter drums, funk guitar, and a more contemporary backbeat. This music was hugely influential on later acid jazz and rare groove scenes in the UK especially. DJs rediscovered records like this decades later because they worked on dance floors. It's fusion not as experiment but as evolution. If the famous fusion records are the skyscrapers, these records are the streets. They show how the musicians actually lived inside the music day to day. Studio dates, club gigs, crossover audiences, radio play, and experimentation happening quietly rather than historically. And sometimes that's where the most replayable music lives. If you check any of these out, start with the tracks I mentioned. I'll leave links to the tracks in a pinned comment below the video. And if you've got a fusion album that you think needs to appear in a future Deep Cuts video, I certainly want to hear about it. Half of the fun of this era is realizing how much of it is still out there to be found. If you want to continue hanging out with me here on the channel, I'll pop a video in the corner for you to click on now. Other than that, I'd like to say thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.